The UN's Economic and Social Council has adopted a resolution removing Iran from its seat on the 45-member Commission on the Status of Women. A draft resolution submitted by the United States called to remove with immediate effect the Islamic Republic of Iran from the Commission for the remainder of its 2022 to 26 term over its policies that are contrary to the rights of women and girls. Sherwin Bryce-Beese reports that the move to expel Iran is seen as a direct response to months of protests sparked by the death in detention of 22-year-old Masha Amani, who was arrested by Iran's morality police, enforcing the country's strict dress code for women.
These women and activists have appealed to us, the United Nations, for support. They made their request to us loud and clear: remove Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. The reason why is straightforward. The Commission is the premier UN body for promoting gender equality and empowering women. It cannot do its important work if it's being undermined from within. Iran's membership at this moment is an ugly stain on the Commission's credibility. Colleagues, in line with our work, votes are often complicated. There are few obviously right and wrong answers in diplomacy, but today we have an opportunity to do something that is clearly the right thing to do. We can act in this moment to support women. We can act in direct response to our constituents, the global community of women. The Iranian government wants nothing more than to wiggle its way out of this vote, to use misinformation and procedural tricks to obscure the truth and avoid accountability. But today, I urge you to keep this simple. We have Iranian women and activists here in the room with us right now. Let's do right by them. Let's do right by women and girls around the world. Let's vote to remove Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. Let's do this for women, for life, and for freedom.
The U.S. request is entirely illegal, as the Council members are fully aware that there is no precedent in the Council practice of terminating an elected member's participation in a functional commission for any alleged reason, nor it is supported by the Council Rule of Procedures. Despite this, one member, a bullying member, notorious for disobeying the UN Charter and international law, intends to pursue its unlawful request to remove an elected member from the Commission only on the basis of unfounded claims and fabricated arguments by means of fabricated and demonizing narrative that it turns set a dangerous precedent and undermining the rule of law at the UN system.
Well, for a bit more on this, we're now joined by Sussan Tahmasebi, who's an Iranian feminist and director of FEMENA, which is a movement for women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again. Did the UN do the right thing?
Well, certainly, I think this was an unprecedented move. It's never happened before. And I think it was the correct move to send a signal to Iranian women and to people inside the country who are protesting, whose rights are being violated. But it's also an important move because no government that disrespects women's rights, that has deep discrimination embedded within law and practice within the system, systematic discrimination within its legal system, should be on the Commission on the Status of Women and charged with the task of advancing women's rights. So not just Iran, but all the other countries who discriminate against women in law and practice should be disallowed to take such positions. But so therefore, I think it's the right move. It sends the right message to Iranian women and to Iranian protesters, many of them women whose rights are being violated. And it also sends a message within the UN that UN stands for rights. So they're not going to tolerate member states taking on this kind of responsibility when within their national legislation they discriminate so boldly and comprehensively against women.
I'm curious about the timing. Is it about abuses during the protests or abuses in general, and that the protests have really put those abuses over time on the radar?
I think because the protests are so much focused on women, the main slogan of the protest is "It's women, life, freedom." It's about women. That the protest initial spark was about the status of, women's rights, and also demanding accountability for the wrongful death of a woman. And that it's brought this issue to the fore and has created an environment where Iran has been removed from the Commission on the Status of Women. But I think it should be deeper. I think that this needs not to be a reactionary measure toward what's happening in a particular country, but it should be part of the UN belief system and the UN standards not to have governments serving in positions that are supposed to be advancing the rights of marginalized groups, women who technically should be marginalized because they're half the population of the world, but being in a position like that while also discriminating so seriously against women. So I think that it's the right move. It's definitely spurred by the protests, but I think the UN needs to take a deeper look at what's happening within the UN system, and especially with women's rights, and make this a general rule for all the countries who violate the rights of women. They should not be serving on the Commission on the Status of Women. And I should say that, in a sense, for those people who follow the UN system, the Commission on the Status of Women is an important place for civil society, for NGOs, for women's groups to come together, and for governments to come together every year to renew their commitments and their plans to advancing women's rights. But unfortunately, because there's a sort of a regressive bloc within the UN system that's consistently pushing back on women's rights, and especially women's bodily rights, but also the rights of sexual minorities, LGBT groups, that this commission has been rendered rather ineffective. So really, this is more than anything, it's symbolic, because the commission has not really been able to do the work that it set out to do, that it's only really, for the most part, trying to protect the gains that it's had in the past. So I think this should be a rallying cry for all the people within the UN system who truly care about women's rights, all those governments who truly care about women's rights, and they should push back against all of the regressive forces that have worked within the UN system to prevent progress on women's rights.
Will this have any effect on Iran? Do they care how the international community looks at them over this issue?
Well, I think definitely it matters. It should matter to every country, because UN is a space for countries to be at and to participate in. So pushing them out of a decision-making role like this definitely impacts them negatively and impacts their image negatively. And I think Iran does care about that. So I think in that sense, I hope that, it serves as a lesson to the Iranian government to treat women better and to treat, women human rights defenders better. And I think in this sense, it's also a really important move, because since the start of these protests, we've had over 170 women human rights defenders arrested and jailed. Most of these women human rights defenders, they're women advocating for human rights, but the majority of them are also advocating for women's rights. And the security forces in Iran have made it so that, they attribute the demand for women's rights to external forces, to the diaspora community, to Iran's enemies, and refuse to recognize that this is an indigenous and demand that Iranian women have had for over 100 years, and therefore the government refuses to adhere to the demands of the Iranian women, and instead decides to arrest and punish with long prison terms the women who actually advocate for women's rights, and accuses them of national security crimes instead of listening to them and changing discriminatory laws against women.
This council is made up of 54 members, 16 voted against, and I just wonder, Russia and China, huge nations, influential, voting against this. This must be a disappointment for you.
No, of course. I mean, it's not a disappointment. I mean, not that it's not a disappointment, but it's not anything that we didn't expect. Russia and China and Iran and majority of the other very seriously authoritarian states always work together in blocks to prevent the advancement of rights of citizens around the world. And so it's a disappointment. Yes, maybe it's a disappointment, but it's definitely not a surprise. We expected that. What I'd like to see is that, the global South engaged more in votes like this, demanding human rights and women's rights. And I think, unfortunately, that a lot of the global South countries either voted against this measure or abstained from the vote. So in that sense, I think that is a disappointment to me, if anything, more than China and Russia. I don't expect China and Russia to do anything for Iranian women. I don't even expect them to do much of anything for their own population. So I think everyone knows that they're huge rights violators within their own countries.
All right. Okay. Significant step by the UN Council. But thank you so much indeed for joining us and explaining some